since about 1993, I've been studying the question of the sexual objectification of females. And as a psychologist, I've always been really interested in what are the kind of psychic consequences for girls and women of existing in a cultural milieu where the female body is just sort of always scrutinized, always used to sell things from tires to shoes, and what that sort of means in terms of the lifespan development of girls and women over time. How do they incorporate a kind of sexually objectified standard into their own psyches? And what must that mean? I got a phone call from the American Psychological Association in 2005, and they asked whether I might want to serve on a task force. The APA will sometimes name task forces if they perceive that there's some kind of potential mental health risk out there. The task force was on the sexualization of girls. And the concern had become, are we seeing an increasingly sexually objectifying treatment of younger and younger girls? And what can we do about that? Is it the case that this is a problem? Not only were we asked to document the extent of the problem, but also should we be concerned about girls' own mental health? We had really identified 3 sources of the sexualization of girls. One is a cultural source. It's one that we're all becoming increasingly aware of. And so we examined research on marketing and products to girls. Something that's really interesting is the proliferation of what I would call kind of downsized stores and downsized magazines. So for example, there's a store called The Limited. Suddenly there was a store called The Limited 2, where you took adult women's clothing and merely made the sizes smaller. So Abercrombie came out with Abercrombie Kids. And so the downsizing of adult style clothing for youth, and particularly for girls. So there are a lot more of those stores available for girls. And also the downsizing of adult, highly sexualized magazines. So now we have Cosmo Girl. Every one of the adult women's magazines has a girl version. Even a magazine like 17, for example, isn't read by 17-year-olds. No 17-year-old would be caught dead reading 17. That's more like an 8 or 9-year-old magazine. We also identified an interpersonal source of sexualization. And so one of the things we were surprised to discover is how often parents and teachers and many of the people who are supposedly looking out for the best interest of children are encouraging a hypersexualized persona in young girls. We found an example of a study of girls in kindergarten who, during dress-up play, were often encouraged by the teachers to strut their stuff when they're dressing up, and to really, in other words, I think the idea here is that femininity has come to be associated with sexiness. And if femininity a generation ago was associated with domesticity, I think Naomi Wolf in her book, The Beauty Myth, convinced me that a cultural shift sort of happened, and we now associate sort of idealized femininity not with domesticity as much anymore, but with sexiness. And increasingly, we're applying that sexy standard to younger and younger girls.
When she wears the fake boobs and the fake butt, it's just like it's an added, extra bonus. And it's really funny when she comes out on stage, then everybody thinks it's hysterical because they all of a sudden realize that not only is she Dolly, she has the enhancements just like Dolly has. Turn around, let me zip you up. Pull your booty down. We tend to score really well with it all the way around from most everybody. Let me see. Fluff your hair. Is that what Dolly does? What else does Dolly do?
I love dressing up as Dolly.
Who are you?
Dolly.
Dolly who?
Dolly Parton.
Girls are not passive recipients of all these cultural messages. Girls are active agents. And I think we know from cognitive psychology, developmental cognitive psychology, that young boys and girls, once they know what their gender is, they're very motivated to be the best example of their gender. And if the examples of femininity around you are sort of a tarted up, kind of pornographized sexuality, then that's what you're psyched to be. So I've often told an anecdote of a time many summers ago when my family was living in Berlin for the summer, and my younger daughter, who was 7 years old at the time, we were on a streetcar and we were moving through the city, and we had come to a part of Berlin, it was Berlin after all, where prostitutes were soliciting openly. And I remember looking out the window, and my young daughter, 7 years old, was just really enchanted with these women. Some of them, of course, had long hair extensions, vinyl thigh-high boots. They were working the streets, and my daughter looked out the window and she said, "Oh, Mommy, look, they're so beautiful. They look just like Bratz dolls." And in fact, they did look like Bratz dolls. Coming back full circle to that cultural contribution to the sexualization of girls. For my daughter, a Bratz doll was a beautiful image of femininity. And here she saw, walking the streets of Berlin, exactly that exemplary kind of sexed up femininity. And to her, that was beautiful. And also as a 7-year-old at that point in life, she's very motivated to want to be that same kind of great femininity. So I'd say the third source of sexualization is girls themselves. I think we have to ask the question of, how did feminine sexuality move to a place where now it's about display? And I suppose with, the case of Anthony Weiner, male sexuality is increasingly about display as well. We're living in a world where the documentation of our life seems to be even more important than the living of it. And so the sending of images and the sharing of the portrayal of your sexuality, as opposed to the engagement in private with another person of your two sexualities, seems to be increasingly common. What you give up when you internalize a third person point of view on how you look and your sexuality is that first person point of view. There's only so many cognitive resources that you have. So studies have actually shown that girls and young women who have this more self-objectified or self-sexualized view of themselves perform more poorly on concurrent cognitive tasks. We did a study where we had college students try on swimwear alone in a dressing room. The control condition, they were trying on sweaters. The cover story was a kind of consumer decision-making study. And there you are alone in a dressing room. If you're female and you're standing in a swimsuit as opposed to a sweater, you don't do as well on a math test that we say, "Oh, while you're getting used to this garment in the dressing room, could you help us with this study for the math department?" And so women perform more poorly on the math test in swimsuits than in sweaters, and no difference for men. We've shown that girls with a more self-objectified view on themselves are less likely to use proper birth control during sex to make poor sexual decisions, to be more likely to give, but much less likely to get oral sex. And so putting themselves at greater risk in terms of sexual decision-making. This phenomenon is not insignificant in the mental and even physical health of girls and young women themselves. There's this movement, it's a very new movement, it's called positive psychology, and a lot of really great research and a lot of good work is coming out and, looking at the positive emotions of human experience. Psychologists have, ever since Freud, looked at the underbelly. And I feel as though I've been doing negative psychology for a really long time. One of the things that I'm moving toward right now is to try to figure out some more positive psychology to combat some of these issues. And here's an example. I want girls to laugh about their boobs and their periods. And I think that if we can stop sanitizing, let's say, menstrual marketing, and turn these kinds of corporeal bodily events that are about our emerging sexuality into sources of mirth and good humor and, maybe even gratitude, then I think some good things could come of that. So I have some ideas about the next phase of my research. I get a sabbatical soon, and I want to start thinking about some programming right around menarche, right around when girls are starting to get their first periods. Some programming around the physical body, the corporeal, creaturely body, that's about levity and good humor and about a kind of becoming full of oneself. And I'm hoping that that's a new place that I can go, and I'm hoping that it works.